I was going to talk a little bit about how I came to write this book and what my idea of history is. And then I'm going to show some pictures from the book. So this book really starts in 1976. I know that's a long time ago. The book itself begins with the first settlers in Napa, who were Mexican settlers. But by the fact that it begins in 1976 is that's when I started to teach, or was asked to teach, women's history at Napa College. And I had never studied women's history. I didn't really know what it was. And it was just being created by scholars across the US. And basically what it was is the idea that ordinary people have a history and that her history is worthy. So whether those people are women or not women, their voices need to be part of history. And that created a field called social history. And so my course actually was called The Social History of American Women. And that meant it wasn't going to be about the famous women. It wasn't going to be about the first ladies. It was going to be about real people. So the students were asked to find a real person and interview her and write up her life story. That's how I started. And so all the students lived in Napa. So all of a sudden, every year I was reading hundreds of the life stories of women in Napa. And out of that, I started to learn Napa history, really from these first person accounts. We figured out how to do interviews slowly. We taught ourselves how to do oral history. I practiced doing oral history myself, and some of the oral history that I did myself ended up in this book. Ruth Northrup, who founded the Napa Historical Society, was a mother-in-law of a friend of mine, and she brought a talk on women in Napa history to my daughter's second grade class. And from that, I learned that there indeed had been women in Napa history. Jane Smith and Louis Azzetti were writing wonderful columns in the Napa Register, which I read and clipped out. And so from them, I also started to learn Napa history. And many decades later, in the early 2000s, I got an invitation to write a book about Napa from Arcadia Publishing. They were just starting to write the history of small towns across America. So I thought that because I had been hearing about this town from so many people, that I maybe could write a book about the regular people of Napa. And it would be informed by my understanding of women's history, but also California, which by then I was teaching, and a class called Napa History, which I created with Stephanie Gross. So that's how I started my first book. My second book is a focus on farming. It's called Napa Valley Farming, and I did it with my dear friend, Paula Amon Judah. My third book was called Napa Valley Chronicles. It was a collection of stories about from Marketplace Magazine. I've been writing articles about people that contacted me and wanted me to write their family story or their neighbor's story. And then as I was teaching Napa history with Stephanie Gross, she learned about a little farm in Rutherford where they made silk. And so we wrote this book together called Frankie's Journey. So at that point, I didn't think I was going to write any more history about Napa. However, I had some articles that I thought were really important that had never been published. So I asked the publisher if they'd like to publish a second volume of Napa Valley Chronicles. And they said no, but they had a series called Lost, and would I like to contribute to the series called Lost? And they emphasized that that series was about places, not people. Normally, I wrote about people, but they wanted me to write about places. So I had to take all the material I had and rethink it and have it fit into the frame of place. And to be in this book, it had to be a place that was no longer used for what it was originally built for. So if you look at the cover, this is the famous castle. This is what Napa State Hospital looked like. It was called the Asylum originally, and it was for all kinds of people. my husband's father was put there for being an alcoholic. And that's how my husband came to Napa, was because his father was put in there. And most of the early residents, in fact, were alcoholics. Some of them were wives who were just unhappy. And when I was teaching there in the late 70s, it was the people that are now homeless who always had shelter in the asylum and always had shelter in the Napa State Hospital. I'll talk a little bit more about Napa State Hospital when we get to that section of the book on the slideshow. So on the side here is the Fox Theater, which no longer exists. Napa State Hospital has become a different place than it was. Okay, so I'm ready for the pictures now. Next slide, yeah. So this is one of the earliest settlers of Napa, Cayetano Juarez and his son Lito. They were awarded a huge tract of land by Mariano Vallejo, who conquered this area from the indigenous and then gave huge tracts of land away to his soldiers. So his tract of land is what we call East Napa, and it includes the area of the state hospital. It includes Alta Heights, and it also included part of the downtown, the east of Saskell downtown, which became an area called Little Italy that we'll get to. So he was enormously influential, and his, and Tulake Cemetery is also on his land. He sold part of his land for Tulake Cemetery and part of his land for the state hospital. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is the St. Joseph's Farm. This is this wonderful experiment in teaching orphan boys to do agriculture that took place in Rutherford. The school was downstairs and the dorm was upstairs. This is a picture of the building itself. Beautiful picture. And as I said, Stephanie Gross did all this original research, and then we wrote a children's book about a child who came here via ferry from San Francisco. All the kids came from an orphanage in San Francisco, and then they walked from Vallejo up to Rutherford because they were bringing cows and horses with them, so they had to walk. It was a long trip. We had to think about where they would have slept and what it would have been like to walk from Vallejo to Rutherford. Next slide. And this shows what is there now. This is called Round Pond Winery. It's on the land that was the St. Joseph's Agricultural Institute. And these are their gardens. Next. Oh, I should say that the school lasted from about 1907 to the late 20s. Okay, this is Ruth von Eulett. She was one of the last farmers inside the town of Napa, who I was privileged to know. She moved to Napa because her uncle was an orchardist for the state hospital. Many of you probably know the state hospital did what they called moral therapy, where they taught people how to relax by raising crops, by raising animals and vegetables and fruit. They also had them doing basket weaving and a lot of other crafts, some of which I also had my own students do when I was a teacher, because I was impressed with how therapeutic it was to do crafts. So Ruth operated her own family farm from the 30s through the 90s, up by where Nob Hill Market is now. Next. Yes, this is William Jacks, whose name I could not remember for some reason. William Jacks was a outstanding pioneer who came to Napa and operated a jewelry business downtown. He was also kind of a town father in that he helped found the Tulake Cemetery and the Presbyterian Church. And he donated this silver cruet that you're going to see in the next slide to the church. You can go to the next slide. And this picture of the cruet, I actually took myself at the Presbyterian Church downtown. How he fits in the book is that he had a wonderful nursery on the banks of the Napa River and used the river water to irrigate it and grew the biggest aloe vera plants that anybody had ever seen, plus an amazing amount of fruit, which ended up at the state fair in Sacramento. His house is no longer there. It was washed away in a flood, but it was located at, as I have calculated it, the corner of what we would now call Riverside and Oak. So it would be around where what we used to call Giovanoni's Market is, or was. It's now the Magalani's Market. Yes, and Debbie Fortune is his descendant, who's been very kind to share a lot more information with me about him that you'll find in the book. Next. Yes, and this is Little Italy. One of the people who really helped me with this book was Ray Godani. He's pictured here. Yeah, you can keep he put together this map of Little Italy. This is his book called The Squeezebox Kid, which is a great memoir. And that's the next picture on the slideshow. You can go to that now, is a picture of him with his accordion that he used to finance his way through law school. He became a judge here in Napa. But he writes with great specificity about, thank you, Debbie, for reminding me, he was the first silversmith in San Francisco, William Jacks. Very important to note that. Ray Godani grew up, his father ran I think you'd call it a junkyard downtown. So he writes really interestingly about the Italian community that lived downtown and what had been Cayetano Juarez's land around what we now call the Oxbow. Okay, next. And here is the castle. And this is Napa State Hospital in the 30s. And this is when it was really booming and about 1 in 3 residents worked there. So literally everyone knew someone who worked at the state hospital, or maybe you knew somebody that had been committed to the state hospital, but definitely it was a big part of the town. It was really what the town was known for outside of Napa, was the state hospital. The kind of nickname was, well, they called it Imola, but they also used to joke that Napa was the land of fruit and nuts. By that, they meant the orchards and the inhabitants of the state hospital. It became known as the state hospital in the 20s. So I wanted to make sure that some of the people who had worked there were included in this book. So the next slide is Peter's wetsuit. You can go to the next slide. And there he is. He worked there for 22 years as a psych tech. And he was both a psych tech, a supervisor, and a warehouse worker. And the big thing about the state hospital is it offered stable employment. I wrote about it in the chapter called Where We Worked. So the whole book is organized into where we farmed. And then Ruth von Eulett represented that in Cayetano Juarez. Where we lived, that was represented by William Jacks and Ray Godani. And where we worked is represented by Napa State Hospital, as seen here. And there's in that next slide. So there's a lot more places of employment covered than what I'm going to talk about tonight. This is Rita Boardwell, who it was my pleasure to meet. I happened to move to Napa the year she died, but it took 25 years before I learned about who she had been. She was the unofficial historian of the fire department. There was no official historian. She was the only historian. She was also the historian of the labor movement in Napa and wrote a history of the labor movement. She lived here all her life. She was born on Palmer Street, and she helped to found the Firefighters Museum, which was a wonderful resource we had on Main Street until very recently when we lost that building. But the next slide shows a picture of the Firefighters Museum. And this is a mannequin wearing the uniform of Jane Dizelle, who was the first woman firefighter in Napa, hired in 1985. And so I happened to take this photograph, never knowing that we would actually lose the Firefighters Museum and all of what's in it would just be, stored in boxes somewhere. But I was really glad that I was able to find this picture to give us a little bit of memory of this wonderful museum that we had. And I have quite a bit about the history of firefighters in Napa in the book. The next slide, I believe, is from Sawyer. Yeah, so this is color wheel workers. And Sharon Arnold wrote to me after she saw this picture. She said, that's her father on the right. He went in at 7 and worked until everything was done. And many days that was early afternoon. So he would fish the Napa River. That's the kind of detail that I love. I love to use pictures where we actually know the names of the people. That's a really important thing for historians to do. And as I was telling Elaine at the beginning, I feel like I've tried to marshal the collective voice of many people who've lived in Napa so that this book is their story. Next slide. And here are Cameron shirt workers. This is a picture I had never seen until I was working on this book. And Wendy Beltrami kindly shared with me this picture. That's her mother, Gail Randall. She wrote an arrow to her mother. Cameron Shirt Company opened in 1905. In 1955, it became part of Rough Rider. It was a big, important source of income, as you can see, of camaraderie and fun. And they produced shirts. That's why it was called a shirt company. Okay, next slide. And this is Basil Shipyard. This was another place where people could have a decent living working with their hands. And it also produced many of the ships that basically won World War II. So it was a hugely important place, both as a site of employment and as an assist in the war effort. The next picture is one of the shipyard workers who I met. That's Sweet Johnson. He also became a beekeeper after he retired. And in the book, I quote from his memories of working at Basalt and the enormous love that all the workers had for each other and all the decades they spent together. They really felt like a family. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, Michael Amon, you'll be happy to see that this is the mug that you gave me a picture of. This is the Dream Bowl, which Michael Amon could have much more to say about than me, but it was built during the war, right, Mike? Yeah, it was built during World War II. And because there were so many people that were working in Mare Island and at Basalt, the Dream Bowl was right in between Napa and those work sites. And people got to let off steam, have romances. It became a place where country music was performed, and eventually the Grateful Dead came and performed there in the late 60s. And Michael Amon has traced that whole story in his book, which I have here on the Dream Bowl, and which I heartily recommend. Okay, next slide. So these are from the section of the book called Where We Played. I had to think about what play was. So I decided play was what people did at the Dream Bowl. Play was what people did at the bowling alley. And this shows you how important the identification with Kaiser was. Kaiser is what Basalt became in the 50s and 60s. And so here's the Kaiser workers on a bowling team. I wrote a lot about Bel Air Bowl because people had so many memories of it, including me. And I wanted to try to get as many people's memories in as I could. It was a family again, the people that worked there, the people that bowled there. It was a melting pot of all kinds of cross-section of Napa. And if you're wondering where it was, it's where Target is now. Target is now basically in that area. Petco, I guess, not Petco, that fancy pet store. All right, next slide. And these are some people that went bowling at Bel Air. This is Larry and Marion Dickerson and Deanna and Dan Krukemeyer Fogarty. And they had a Colonel Sanders, not an impersonator, but a member of the Colonel Sanders family who came in costume as Colonel Sanders, who came to the bowling alley, and they had their picture taken with him. And somehow I managed to find Deanna, and she was kind enough to share this picture from 1969 with me of a very memorable time in her life. Okay, next picture. This is the beginning of Brewsters. And Brewsters, for many of us, was a beloved, what we used to call an Army Navy store or general store before the general store became a kind of a fancy term. This was a real general store where you bought equipment for floods and camping. And this is Mr. Nussbaum, who was the founder. And I got this picture from Rachel Friedman, who was the wife of Larry Friedman, who ran Brewsters for many decades. This next slide. So this section is called Where We Shopped. And I'm very interested in service station history. And this is a beautiful picture of Flock's service station in Yountville, where I have recently learned they kept a bear in a cage in the back. And so while you were getting gas, you could go back and look at the bear in the cage. Just kind of ironic because Napa was full of grizzly bears in the old days. Next picture is of Food City, a very special place, a drugstore, the first drugstore run by a woman, Mary Ann Dowd, who's there on the right, who came here to run a drugstore. She was also an expert in perfume, and her perfume counter was renowned. People would come to get, help with picking certain scents of perfume. She hired Thomas Gracia to be her assistant, and he was in the end the last pharmacist at Family Drug. He passed away a few years ago, and the business had to close just a couple years ago. So it's been a huge loss, the last independently run pharmacy in town, and I have quite a bit of material about it because I wrote an article about it and did an interview with his widow, Roxanne. Next picture is another business that closed in the last few years, Golden Carrot. And there's Lorna Birdsall and her daughter Haley. And they closed in, I believe, 2014. So there were places that were important to people, important to the founding of small independent businesses, that many of which have come and gone. I couldn't possibly document all of them, but Golden Carrot was a particular kind of health food store where people went for all kinds of help and healing. And I wanted to honor that place since it no longer exists. It's in River Park, or it was in River Park Shopping Center. Okay, next. So this is Lupine. It's in the book because the last chapter is called Lost Nature. Carl Franco was a shirt cutter at a Cameron shirt company, but he was also a lover of flowers. He pressed flowers between the sheets of paper, and those pressed flowers were donated to the Napa Nature Museum, and they asked me to research Carl Franco's history. So I uncovered a lot of really interesting stuff about this shirt cutter who died in his 30s at his job at Cameron, and had like an honor guard of Boy Scouts who had gone bird watching with him, and had an obituary, a very long obituary in the newsletter of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So all of that in 35 years. And nobody had ever written about him until I did. So I was really happy that my little bio of him ended up in the Nature Museum with his beautifully pressed lupine flowers and many other flowers from Napa. Next. So this is called the Tranquis. I like to think it's how Tranquis used to look. It's Tranquis, what we would say now is around where the little bridge is by around Silverado Trail and Tranquis. It's called Little Tranquis. This is the way it used to look not that long ago. In the late 1800s, this is where the street called Tranquis, this is what it looked like then. And next is Soskull. This is what the fields looked like in the late 40s, and it's pretty much how it looked when I moved to Napa in 1975. This would be the corner of Soskull and Imola. This is how it looked. And so my book traces the battle between small business and big business and nature and development. that took place in Napa over the last 30, 40 years. And the Lost Nature chapter is about what got lost in that transition from small business to big business and nature to development. Okay, so I think that's the end of the slideshow. And I'm happy to take questions. I made a shorter slideshow so I'd have more time for questions. So hopefully there's questions. And if not, I'll be happy to talk some more.
Okay, so we don't yet have any questions in the chat box, and we'll give people maybe a little bit of time to come out of that wonderful headspace that Lauren just put us all in, and they start rolling in. So I will ask them for you, so please do keep on putting them in there, and I'll ask them in the order we get them. So first one from Susan: when was the hospital built?
About, I think it was 1878, right in there. Might be 1874, in the 1870s. I hope that's good enough. Yeah. And it was part of a whole movement to what they thought of as the treatment of mental illness was going to be different than it had been. It was going to be more enlightened. It wasn't going to be like Bedlam. People weren't going to be in chains. They were going to be in a beautiful country atmosphere. And in fact, they brought them up the river on boats to get to the hospital. Patients would be taken up the river, and then they could just walk into the hospital, because the hospital is what is now Napa College. Okay.
Okay, asking about signed books. So the books that we have now have Lauren's signature on a sticker on them. If you want Lauren to sign them personally to you, I would recommend that you reach out directly to Lauren. Are you okay with that, Lauren?
I can come down. I can come down and sign some books.
It sounds like Diane Pryor is asking for it, but anybody who bought one before we were able to get the stickers on them, I guess let me know. And I can coordinate with Lauren, and I will put my email address. It's just elena@napabookmine.com, and I'll make sure that we make it happen for you. Okay, more questions coming in. One from Gwen. Okay. Was the
can I just say something about that?
Please.
If you know me personally and you want a signed book from Bookmine, I will go down there and sign a book for you. So don't worry about that.
We'll make it happen.
Yeah.
So Gwen is curious, was the Yountville gas station on the main street or the crossroad?
You know, I probably need to look it up in the book to be sure. So do I have a minute to look it up? It says where it is. I just can't remember right offhand, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. So it's in the chapter where we shopped, and I should find it in just a second.
While Lauren's looking, I just have this lovely comment from Debbie. The perspective is so beautiful and respect of people who lived here and love this value. Thank you so much, Lauren, for creating this lost history.
I do have the exact location of the gas station, just north of the St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church on Highway 29. Opened up in 1929. Thank you. Thank you. I think that was from Debbie. Thank you, Debbie.
So Charlotte wants to know about the Maxwell Bridge, when it was built and when it was replaced.
You know, I don't have that in my book. It didn't really fit into my frame of places that we worked or shopped or played. So it was replaced within the last 10 years. And when it was built, I can't tell you, but I did see I know I'm not supposed to look at the questions, but I'll ask the one that I can answer the one Todd Pridey asked, which
Sure.
was a prior question. Do you see that, Elena?
Down towards the bottom. I've got a lot up above it, so no, I'm not quite there yet.
Okay.
But you're welcome to answer it.
It's not on the screen anymore. So I'll wait till you get to it.
Okay. So Barbara is curious whether you include or have information about the old Sunsweet processing plant.
I do have a picture of the old Sunsweet processing plant that actually I took after it was closed, but it was still, you know, such an important location. For most people know it's on Yahomie and Iroquois, that area. And there's, you know, a fair amount about the, I mean, a lot more about prune picking and the whole prune drying operation are in my Napa Valley farming book. I tried not to repeat the material in that book, but I do have some stuff about Sunsweet, yeah, in this book, in the farming section.
Okay, so now I'm to Todd's question. Okay, it's a long one, so bear with me. Is there more evidence of the New Deal in and around Napa beyond the 2nd Street Post Office, work done at the State Hospital, Puda Creek Dam, or the St. Helena Dam? We are in the middle of this unit at NHS, and I love to bring local history into our lessons.
Yeah, so I was really lucky that a friend of mine, Brent, is part of a project called the Living New Deal, and he particularly looked into Napa as a favor to me. And so they worked on the roads extensively, and they especially worked on the fire lookout on Mount St. Helena. That was all done by them, as well as the 4-H camp up in Angwin was done by them. And finally, they set up a recreation program in Napa on Yount Street, which was the beginning of Napa Recreation. They had all kinds of activities there in the late 30s, early 40s, which eventually morphed into what we call the City of Napa Parks and Rec. So there's a lot more detail in the book about it. I really appreciate Brent getting that for me.
A comment and then a question. It's a shame that the state hospital was torn down. It was beautiful. Do you know why it was torn down?
It was considered kind of dirty and moldy and creepy by the 50s. It had kind of deteriorated, and there were, you know, gargoyles. It was kind of a haunting place. It was called the Castle. That's what was torn down, was the Castle. The book I recommend to read about the state hospital is called The Confessions of Madame Psyche, written by Dorothy Bryant, in which her main character ends up in the state hospital in the 40s. And it has a lot about the details of living there, the unknown graves, the Underground Railroad, and all kinds of fascinating details. And it particularly covers the castle. So I highly recommend Confessions of Madame Psyche.
Next question from Sam. Did you uncover anything about the Napanee? She's not sure on the spelling on that, or he, sorry. I can't tell. Sam, I remember being in a high chair there while my parents danced.
Hi, Rachel. No, I don't remember. I think I've seen the Napanee in some Facebook groups about old Napa, but there is another book about old Napa restaurants. So I was asked not to include any restaurants. I'm not sure if the Napanee was a restaurant or a bar, but I was asked not to include any kind of places like that, just because there's another book that Arcadia did about those particular places.
Nancy is wondering about the old Adobe restaurant.
And that was owned by, well, that was part of the Cayetano Juarez home. It was one of his homes. I'm not sure what's happened to it since the pandemic. For a long time, we liked it as a place to have Mexican food and have a full bar and kind of have a sense of old rowdy Napa as it used to be. I'm not sure what's happened to it now. I think they're probably trying to keep it open, as far as I know. It's on Sosco.
And by the way, I just looked up Confessions of Madame Psyche. It is still in print, and we can get it if anybody's interested. You'll need to email me or call the bookstore, but we can get it for you if you're interested in Confessions of Madame Psyche. Okay, Susan's question. How did Napa get shipbuilding?
Oh, that's a good question. you know, one of the things that everybody laughs about is land was so cheap here. Land was so cheap here. Poor people could live in the country here. You could build a big factory here. The Chamber of Commerce bought a whole piece of land by the river just so that Rough Rider would move here from San Francisco. The area that Basalt was built on was basically kind of donated or sold at a very low price to the guy that managed Basalt for many, many decades. That's how it got here, because it wasn't the Bay Area and it was very inexpensive here until quite recently. Really, probably the last 25 years is when it got more expensive. But until then, it was cheap. So lots of things came here.
Brent is wondering, were oral histories important to researching and writing your book?
When or how or what was the first word?
Were oral histories important?
Oh, yeah. So I did a lot of interviews of people, many of whom were no longer alive, that formed the foundation of my understanding, where basically I would take notes or tape record them. Rachel Friedman, who's here in the conversation, I interviewed on one memorable New Year's Eve about her life. And I wrote an essay called Mrs. Brewster's Double Life, because in addition to running Brewsters, she had another life as a teacher. So it's absolutely important to do oral history as much as you can. And I encourage everybody to interview people in their families and their neighbors and get their stories while you can. Yeah.
Another question from Todd. Did you by chance cover any information on Shipyard Acres in this book?
I did. And I have a wonderful picture of Shipyard Acres, and there's not too many pictures that are available, but I have a picture of the whole tract, which is where people were living during World War II. It was wartime housing. It was very affordable. It was almost free for people that were working at Mare Island. And it was on a tract of land south of town that was like heaven for the kids, where they could roam around and feel safe. There was a little store there. There's a beautiful memory of growing up there that was written by Mildred Collins that I included in my book. And so that's in the section called Where We Lived. Yeah, just so you can find it easily. Yeah.
Okay, I'm at the end of, oh, he says, that's where my mom was born when my grandfather was stationed there during the war. Very cool. Nancy says, Tulake Cemetery doesn't belong in this book, but can you say anything about its history and what's left of the original buildings?
I think most of what was there is still there. It's a very historic spot, very beautiful spot. It was sold by Cayetano Juarez to Tulake Cemetery Association. As I mentioned, William Jacks was one of the co-founders. Peter Manass was the manager until very recently. He came from the family that had developed Sawyer Tannery. It's very historic and beautiful, and contained a special section where the Chinese community were buried. It has a memorial to Mary Ellen Pleasant there, which was recently rededicated. So I encourage anyone to go to Tulake, and it's a wonderful thing that it's all still there, and it preserves a lot of the past.
Okay, I'm getting a couple more just personal messages about people who want their book signed. So if you want your book signed because it's not already, bring it down to the shop on Pearl Street, put my name on it and put your name on it, as well as your phone number, so we know how to reach you. And I'll coordinate with Lauren to get them all signed for you, and then let you know when they're ready for pickup.
So maybe I'll just make a closing comment if there's not another question that you feel like I should answer.
Elizabeth says there's some Mormon folklore around Tulake and Governor Lilburn Boggs. Is that really a name? That's the coolest name I've ever heard. Who is buried there? Lilburn? Really? Wow. That's a name, y'all.
Okay, so what I'd like to say in closing is that it's a challenge to write a book called Lost Napa Valley about everything that's been lost. And at the same time, I feel like it's a celebration, it's an elegy, it's a tribute, it's nostalgia, it's memory. It's a reminder of what used to be here. It's a way for people to feel that their stories matter and their memories matter. So I feel like it's not a sad book, even though it's about things that are lost. And in the acknowledgements, I thank all the people who helped and contributed to the book. And I conclude by saying to my children and grandsons, may what is lost be replaced by what is found. And that's kind of what we have to do now. So thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. And thank you to Napa Bookmine, and please patronize this wonderful little bookstore we have. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you all for joining us. I dropped the link to purchase the book on our website. I'm in the chat, but it's in all 3 stores right now. We have copies, and hopefully we'll get to see some more faces as this whole nightmare gets a little bit better. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Lauren. I wish you all a lovely evening.
Same. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.